It's easy to forget that in 1900 New Zealand was a democracy. In broad terms, an elected government can do anything that the public desires through to what voters will tolerate. There was both support for and tolerance of compulsory military training in 1900 to 1914. This paper examines the rationales of the acquiescent majority rather than the minority of zealots usually discussed. First, a brief outline of CMT. The enabling legislation was passed in December 1909. Practical implementation began in 1911. All British males, essentially not Maori and not Chinese, between 12 and 25 years were required to register for military training. There were few grounds for exemption. 12 to 17-year-olds trained in the cadets. Those from 18 to 25 entered either the general training section for the less fit or the territorial army. Adult training commitments were usually an evening a week, several weekend parades, and an annual 2-week camp. The traditional reasons for the public's endorsement of CMT are militarism, imperialism, loyalty to Britain, concern about German military ambitions, and so on. Those attitudes certainly existed. The leaders of the major political parties were all supporters of imperial defence. The Navy League, Round Table, and other lobbying groups were active in New Zealand. The contention here is that the widespread acceptance of CMT was based on other reasons and concerns, often indirect and non-military ones. What were these other reasons for the public's acquiescence? This paper examines two of them. One, the convergence of urbanisation and changes to gender ratios and employment, and two, race and the infant health organisation, the Plunkett Society. 19th century New Zealand was male-heavy. In Otago in 1861, there were 100 women for every 944 men. Approximately half of adult males in 1911 were single, almost all of whom had never married. It has been argued that many 19th century New Zealand men lived lives of loneliness and misery. Single working men in the 19th century often found employment as itinerant labourers, clearing land, fencing paddocks, draining swamps. The men lived and worked in rough conditions in the back blocks. Paid at the end of their contracts, the men often went to town and promptly blew their money in sickening orgies, as they've been called, of alcohol, gambling and prostitutes. Around the turn of the 20th century, the basis of the New Zealand economy began to change to the export of meat and milk products. Employment opportunities changed too. Most of the new jobs were town-based, semi-skilled and permanent positions in dairy factories, abattoirs and offices. At the same time, the proportion of women in the population approached a balance, and tolerance of wild male behaviour diminished. Employers wanted sober and obedient workers. Women sought reliable husbands to father their children. It was nonetheless accepted that men needed to let off steam. Sport provided that for some. Too frequently, however, sport involved little more than loitering on the sidelines with a beer in one hand and a cigarette in the other. For employers needing fit and dependable workers, and for women seeking steadfast partners, military training offered an ideal combination. Not because it was military, but because it inculcated obedience, forbearance, and duty, and also provided exercise as an outlet for male exuberance. Behavioural requirements brought about by economic and demographic change made compulsory military training an attractive proposition. CMT would help produce good workers and good husbands, and it was expected to tame the wild beast of rural worker behaviour. Moving on to the second point, the publication in 1859 of On the Origin of Species led to the development of social Darwinism and indirectly eugenics. These movements gave credence to the notion that the success of the Anglo world, as it was called, was the result of racial superiority. Fears for that primacy arose during the South African War, when about half of Britain's young men failed to pass medical inspections for military service. Urban living, poor diet, and lack of exercise were blamed. Another person concerned about the fitness of the young was Dr. Truby King, the superintendent of Dunedin's Seacliff Lunatic Asylum and founder of the Plunkett Society, an infant health organisation that stressed the importance of nutrition, hygiene, discipline and routine. King held that babies should be fed by the clock and should defecate on demand. His best-selling book, Feeding and Care of Baby, his wife's syndicated newspaper column, and the hundreds of Plunkett nurses who visited New Zealand's babies and gave advice to mothers were critical to the growth of interest in what was seen as being the scientific development of the human resource. There are two reasons that help explain the rapid uptake of King's methods and views. The notions of better Britons, which is mentioned, I think, in John's presentation, and first-hand experience of racial decline. King's premise that healthy babies make a healthy nation struck a chord in New Zealand because New Zealanders saw themselves as guardians of the Anglo-Saxon gene pool. New Zealand had been settled, New Zealanders immodestly held, by the sturdiest and best of British yeomen. In New Zealand's fresh air, helped by a healthy way of life and world-leading social welfare initiatives, that imported genetic stock more than prospered, it improved. New Zealanders were not merely British, they were, James Belich argued, better Britain. New Zealanders saw themselves in terms of the evolutionary tree as the fresh new growth at the centre top. Although possessing the best genetic stock, New Zealanders worried about larrikinism and that the nation's youth were becoming as sickly as the Britons who had failed medicals for the South African War. These anxieties may have been especially potent for New Zealanders. They had seen Maori subjugated in the 1860s, and by 1900 it was commonly held that Maori were a dying race. Racial decline was a notion New Zealanders didn't merely understand, they had seen it happen. It turned out that Maori were not on the slippery slope to extinction, but it's what New Zealanders believed that matters. Truby King's approach to child rearing was popular. It was also in sync with anxieties about the future of the race and the race-strengthening benefits that compulsory military training could offer. The apparent rationale was, if nutrition and discipline made for healthy and compliant children, it followed that exercise and discipline that military training could offer would make for healthy and obedient young adults, healthy and obedient better Britons. The point of this brief overview is to challenge the notion or the implication that CMT was only popular. It was popular, especially amongst those who championed it. But there were many more people who simply went along with it. Their acquiescence rested on the confidence that CMT complemented aspirations such as changing male behaviour, or that CMT had similar socially beneficial aims and employed Plunkett Society-like scientific methods to improve the nation's young adults. The widespread tolerance of CMT was based less on it being military training and more on its perceived social outcomes that offered something for everybody. Thank you.